Hello, and welcome to the Atlassian platform for developers. This is the last talk of this track, so I'm excited that you've joined us. I'm Sheldon Callahan. I'm with Developer Relations at Atlassian. This is a really exciting talk. Many of you have heard about the announcement, the partnership between Atlassian and Slack. I'm not telling you guys to buy stock. Anyway, just I'm not endorsing any of that, but I am happy to bring Bear Douglas and Trevor Thompson from Atlassian and Bear from Slack to talk about the new opportunity about building with Slack. Little fun facts about the two of them. So Trevor is a regular home improvement guy. He's been building his own house and doing all this DIY Tim the Toolman Taylor stuff. So ask him to see some pictures about what he's been building. And Bear, believe it or not, before she was a developer relations person, she was an archaeologist. And she has published papers about a site in Turkey. So some really well-rounded people. So with no further ado, I'll welcome to the stage.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today. Last talk of the day. You all excited? Pumped? You've got your beers. That's all you need. And again, hi, I'm Bear. I'm from Slack. I lead developer relations.
And I'm Trevor. I'm a product manager on the partner integrations team here at Atlassian. I also want to say thanks to Sheldon for the warm welcome. He also shared an awesome fun fact with us earlier that he ran a Zen temple, which I feel like that's pretty much the coolest fun fact you could possibly share. So kudos to Sheldon for that. So Bear and I are here to talk a little bit today about building for Slack and how to turn chatter into action. If you remember in July, Slack and Atlassian announced a strategic partnership, and part of that partnership was a commitment to building deeper and more powerful integrations with Confluence, Bitbucket, Trello, and Jira. Out of that announcement, Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Atlassian, had a really cool quote. And he said, "We are taking big steps together to drive fundamental improvements in the experience of millions of people around the world who are using our products together every single day." I think this is an awesome quote because it actually really applies to all of us here. Slack and Atlassian has a huge group of users that we can all be taking advantage of and helping their daily workflows. So as we kick off this strategic partnership, we want to encourage you and invite you to do the same thing. So on the agenda today, we only have a few items. The first we'll talk about is why you should consider building for Slack. Then Bear's going to share a little bit about some of the developer resources that are available to you. And we'll talk about some of the use cases and best practices that we've learned from some of our vendors who have built for both Atlassian and Slack.
So if you were at the keynote yesterday morning, you've probably heard some of the stats that we're going to be talking about today. But one of the things that is facing a lot of modern organizations is that the average enterprise has over 1,000 cloud services that they use every single day as a group. And the average knowledge worker inside those organizations is using 36. So when you're trying to do work across all these different services, that adds up into a lot of context switching. There are lots of different places that information can go, and finding information, staying focused in that kind of work can be really difficult. So when you build some of these services into Slack, the idea is that you can help reduce that context switching. Bring certain tasks into conversational context that help people get work done that they need to be doing with their colleagues. At the end of the day, communication is at the heart of what we do at work every single day. You can be writing code on your own, you can be drafting the first version of the design for a UI for your app, but after that, you have to talk to your colleagues. You have to coordinate with them to get it actually shipped and out the door. So there are two different ways that we think about the value of apps built into Slack. The first is basic notifications. You just want to know when something has happened inside another service. And getting that alert in a place where you can think about all the alerts and all the people who might need to know about that information is really helpful. But what we also are able to do with our platform is let you complete work, a full workflow from notification to action that goes back into that other service, all without leaving Slack. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we do that in the context of workflows.
Yeah, it's super interesting because as developers have started building notifications and actions and pulling those into Slack, we've kind of created the modern world of workflows. And if you think about how software companies now are using more products than ever, maybe your marketing team has 10 different apps they're using, your data analytics team might have a few different apps that they're using. You multiply that over a whole organization, there's so many different products. And because we're starting to use chat so much and spending so much time in it every day, it's really the natural intersection of where to pull these things in together. So we just really want to encourage you to kind of jump in on that train of workflows, because it really is how people are operating today, and it's a critical part of how people do work today.
And you'd be in good company too. Oop. You'd be in good company too. We have over 200,000 weekly active developers building on Slack, over 1,500 apps in the app directory, and most paid teams that use Slack also use apps inside Slack. The number is 94% now, and it's been growing. 6 months ago, it was 90. So we see more and more that teams that are coming to Slack for the first time are aware of the fact that you can bring apps into Slack. You can get information from other services there, and you can actually get work done without leaving the client. So we see rapid adoption among both developers and end customers inside these apps. So how do you actually get started? Well, the first thing that we suggest that you do is go and create a free team on slack.com. We don't have a developer sandbox type of environment, so the way that we suggest that you keep your dev work considerate and not interrupt any of your colleagues' daily work is to create a free team. And that'll be something that lets you test your apps as you're building. Next, when you go to api.slack.com, that's where you'll be able to actually create an app, get your API keys, get your first authorization token. And when you go in through this flow, what you'll see up at the top is there is a call out for the next generation of apps. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later on in the presentation, but you can decide at this point whether you want to opt in to that new style of app called Workspace Apps, or whether you want to continue with a token that is current now, but we will be calling legacy in probably another 6 months. So in thinking about the design for your application, we have a pretty strong feeling that there is certain type of work, quick contextual tasks that belong inside Slack. You would never go into Slack to compose a legal document and try and talk about that with your colleagues from inside the client, but you might want to build an approval workflow, or you might want to manage your calendar or have a bot call a meeting for you. Those are the types of quick actions that make sense when you're talking with your team to build in. So when you're thinking about the user experience you're building, start off by figuring out where users should find you inside Slack. Is this something where people discover you because their colleagues are talking about it in a channel? Would it be something where you would expect that somebody invokes through a command? Or is this a different type of action where you would want to be able to send message content directly into your application? There are 4 key touch points inside the Slack client where people discover apps. So on the left-hand sidebar, you'll see that there are channels, direct messages, and then apps at the bottom. And so that's how people who are using a workspace might find that your app is installed already. Beyond that, they might receive a notification. That notification might get piped into a channel that they belong to, or they might get a DM from the app. And this is great, lightweight stuff for anything to do with, say, calendaring, if you just want to know when's my next meeting, or for alerts like from OpsGenie or PagerDuty, the information that an event has happened, and then it needs your attention. The next place that people can find your app is through a slash command. If any of you have used Slack and you've seen the feature /remind, that's something that we've built into the client, so you can ask Slack to remind you to do something in 5 minutes, in 10 minutes, whenever you want. Slash commands are a way that people can invoke apps directly. So if, for example, you want to send your colleague a GIF, you can write /Giphy, and then a search term for the kind of GIF you want. And then when you hit enter, you'll be able to shuffle between GIFs and send it in. So it's that user-generated action, that user statement of intent that you're watching for with the slash command. With actions, these are a newly released feature that allow you to send any sort of message content into another app. Users discover this either by long pressing on the message on mobile or on hover on desktop and the little context menu that appears. So you can build into Slack's UI and say, if somebody is long pressing or hovering, we want to send this message content to my app. Best practice there is to pop up a dialogue so that people can edit that content before it goes off, and we can talk a little bit more in depth if message actions are something you want to use. The last thing are bot users. Bot users are a way that you can give your app a name, a face, a personality, and we see a lot of apps using that to create really great conversational interfaces. One of those is a bot called StatsBot that helps marketing teams pull up reports that otherwise would be more complex to set up reporting flow. You can say, hey StatsBot, I want to see my weekly traffic segmented by region to my website. And StatsBot interprets that smartly, pulls from Google Analytics, and creates that report for you. So there are lots of cool experiences you can build inside Slack, and I encourage you to start thinking of the end-to-end user flow before you pick the APIs you could use. When it's time to pick the APIs you want to use, don't be scared by this flowchart. This is something that is both available on our docs, and if you just turn your brain off for a second and listen, we can walk through what this is saying. There are 3 ways to access Slack's API. We have a socket-based API called the Real-Time Messages API, and that's useful for if you really prefer to maintain your connection to Slack through a socket. Like say you have a firewall that you want to respect, and you can connect to us that way. Downside of RTM is that you get the full fire hose of all message content coming from Slack. It's a lot to handle. So we also have an event-based API that you can subscribe to. It does involve exposing an endpoint to the public internet so we can ping you. But once you've done that, we can either send you messages specifically at mentioning your app or after certain events happen. You can subscribe to those all on api.slack.com. The last piece is just our web API. It's an RPC-style API, and it's good for pulling in static content. So if, for example, you want to see the list of channels, you can reliably figure that that doesn't change second over second. So for most apps, you'll be using some combination of the web API for pulling static data and the events API for responding to events. So if you are interested in figuring out how to choose the right API for your needs, we have a great blog post about that. And this flowchart features in there in a much more readable size. So resources. We want to support you as you are building your apps for the first time. So we have a lot of guides that exist on api.slack. That is our starting point for everything you want to do. It's our documentation. It's where you actually create the API key. It's your one-stop shop for finding what you need. The next part is that we've actually published a set of best practices for app design when you're thinking about conversational interfaces. And also we have a set of clonable, remixable blueprints that are available on our GitHub, which is Slack API for all of our code samples. And those are for basic things like wanting to build an approvals notification flow, or if you have a new user joining your team and you want to send them your code of conduct, how do you have a new user greeting? So we have templatized versions of all of these apps that you can build just for your team and grab that code. The next thing is that we have a pretty robust set of developer tools. We have SDKs first party for both Node and Python, and if any of you have been using Hubot inside HipChat, we also have a Hubot adapter for Slack. So if you have been writing Hubot integrations in particular, we have a migration guide at the back of the room for what's different between ours and HipChats, so that migration can go pretty smoothly. We also have an app that you can install inside any workspace called Slack Developer Tools. And one of the things that it does is let you inspect element on messages that get sent from apps. So in apps inside Slack, some of them have pretty rich UI design. And if you just want to copy the great design that you've seen from another app, you'll be able to use Slack Developer Tools to do just that. We also have a testing framework, Sano, for helping you write tests to and from Slack. So here's how SDT works. Once you've installed it on your workspace, we talked about message actions before as a way that you can have inroads to an app. So you hover over here, click that, send it to SDT, and it pings back all of the JSON that created that pretty message. So every message that you send to Slack can send a JSON payload, and we interpret that into buttons, text, images, and so on. So if you want human help, you can talk to us today. Hi, I'm here, and the columns at the back. Wave. Yeah, nobody turned. Well, columns at the back too, and we're both wearing the Slack shirts. We're easy to spot, and we're happy to talk about any of the migration questions you might have. You can also get in touch with our support team. We do email support, but I promise we're pretty fast on the draw. So if you either write to feedback@slack.com or from the Slack client, type /feedback, that'll go directly to our dev support team, and we're here to help. The last place, too, is that there is a community-led Slack workspace called the Bot Developer Hangout, and that's where people who are building chatbots for a bunch of different chat platforms hang out, talk shop, and help each other out. So we are trying to be the most open we can be with our developer community. So our platform roadmap is open on Trello. If you search Slack Developer Roadmap Trello, you'll be able to see what's coming on the platform, including details about things like the new way of writing apps, and a few other things that are on our midterm and long-term horizons. So you can keep track of what's actually changed through our changelog, and you can see the future through the platform roadmap. And that's something where we're in constant conversation with our dev community. So if you've ever gone to a Slack developer event, you might see that we print out the roadmap and we're interested in your feedback, just like there was an exercise outside today where people were able to say, don't change this about Atlassian. I want to see this improved. We do those types of voting too, and we'd love your feedback. So you can also find it on Trello at any given time.
All right, so let's talk about some of the best practices and use cases. So we worked with a couple of vendors to put this deck together and talk to them about what they found when they were trying to build for both Atlassian and Slack. The first one that we talked to was Obi. So if you're not familiar with Obi, it's a knowledge management tool that's primarily driven via Slack. So you can go into Slack and say, hey, what's the office address? Or where's that document that I've been looking for all day? And so with Obi, what we're going to talk about is some conversational UX design patterns that we've learned and that they can share with us. The first thing that you need to remember is humanize and do not overthink it. For the past 2 years, actually in 2016, chatbots were going to change the world. People thought that interacting with a bot was the future. And then people realized, well, actually, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to spend all your time typing out messages. It's just not the same as a human interaction. And so it's important to not overthink your AI. Don't try to use some kind of crazy knowledge natural language processing because it's just not worth it. In this OB example, I basically say hello, and they have a very minimal AI that understands what the intent was, which is I said hello. They also aren't asking me for, oh, what's your credentials, what's your login URL. This could be a back and forth conversation with me and OB, but they've chosen not to and chosen to actually kick you out to a link instead. So when you have the ability to, it's always best to use buttons. Instead of having people interact with your bot in that way, it's better to just give them a list of buttons just like on the web and let them click that. It's a much more acceptable design pattern and what people understand on Slack and how to use it. So let's talk a little bit about Slack's attachment. So attachment is a design pattern for Slack that's reused by almost all bots. OB, and for example here, is saying the same example I used earlier, which is what is the office address, and it responds with 303 Colorado Street and a couple buttons that say yes or no, this was relevant to me, or it actually was the wrong answer. With an attachment, that you just really get the structured content. That's the main thing. Like, people understand what an attachment looks like when they're using Slack, they understand how to use them, and it looks the same, so they know that it's a bot message. The primary thing, that, in my opinion, for an attachment is the color. So you get this color bar on the side. It's really used to communicate intent. I've seen a lot of developers use it similarly to how you would use bootstraps, warning, or info, or primary tags whenever you're trying to publish something on the web. So it's really, like, you could use it for green here. OB said, yeah, this is your result. You could also use red if maybe something's on fire and you need to signify that. I've also seen developers use it a lot for brand. So maybe you have a unique brand that you want to stand out in a sea of conversations that's happening. So if you had an orange brand, you could make that orange. You really have full control over that.
I think Opsgenie does that.
Who?
Opsgenie.
Yeah, Opsgenie. There you go.
Just
yeah,
message, it's
yes. The brand is a lot of people do that, and it's pretty useful. So the meat of an attachment are really the title and text. It's pretty straightforward. The text is at the bottom. You can see 303 Colorado Street. You actually have full control over that with Markdown, so you'd be able to bold things or italicize them. At the top, you also have the title. The title is really, it's obvious to the user because they always expect it to be at the top. It's always bold. You can also make it link to things. The last thing I'm going to talk about are buttons, and we'll go into it a little more detail on the next slide. But buttons are what I was talking about earlier, the primary method that you want people to be interacting with your app. Say that I asked OB for something, it responded, and it gave me a couple of buttons. I can very quickly just say, yes, that was the right result, or no, it wasn't, instead of having to type out, yes, that was the right result, or anything else. So with buttons, you always want to make sure that you keep them simple. Similar to web design patterns that everyone's seen, like, you want to keep the number of options that you give users pretty straightforward. In this case, OB just has the 2 buttons there, or at the very bottom it says, is this not what you were looking for? And you can submit a request and get a response. The really important thing about buttons is it's important to remember that they're contextual. So when you send a button to a channel, anyone can click that button. Anyone would be able to click the button regardless of who is intended to click the button. And so Slack also offers a way you could either send an ephemeral message, which is to a specific user in a channel, or you could send that message to a user via direct message to ensure that the right person has the ability to click that button. I've seen this numerous times with bots where they publish something to a room and someone else clicks the button even though it wasn't intended for that person. It can get really confusing. The last thing that I've realized over the past few years is like people use the update message pretty regularly. In this example here, when we click submit request, you can see it actually updates the message. Actually, in this case, on that case, it does. So you submit the response, and then it updates the message saying sit tight. This is a really important design pattern because you don't want to leave the buttons in the chat. You want to update the message and get rid of the buttons so people can't click on it anymore. But then you also, it's just like it's the right way to do it because it feels interactive to the user. They click the button and it updates right there in line. The next thing we'll talk about is mobile. So what's interesting on Slack is mobile really comes free. If you think back several years, even today, people have spent so much time designing mockups for web and mobile. And so with Slack, you don't actually have to do that. Slack kind of takes care of this for you. The important thing to remember when building for mobile, though, is you should be considering mobile. So you don't have to design necessarily for mobile, but you need to consider what your app is going to look like on mobile. In this case, it's pretty straightforward because they kept the buttons simple, but I've seen plenty of cases where they have 4 buttons and a drop-down, and then you realize you don't even have scroll space on your phone, and it can get really messy. So just keep in mind, like, avoid complexity, keep mobile in mind, but you don't necessarily have to explicitly design for mobile.
So attachments are a pretty great flexible way to make your messages from your app stand out, look interactive, and be glanceable. And that's a word I learned when they debuted the Apple Watch, glanceable. But you get what it means. At a glance, you should be able to understand if something is very important or if it's something that you can take action on. And in order to make this even more flexible for designers and for developers, we're working on a new UI framework that we call BlockKit that should give you even more options for making the messages that you put into Slack beautiful, glanceable, and actionable. So we're including new elements like inline actions and context. You can see in the upper right-hand corner those smaller design elements that can give people an understanding of what else is in your message. Image we already support. Actions, of course, are supported, but you'll see a much more flexible and consistent way that we represent these elements in JSON. We'll also be adding in V1 a divider. It's a small thing, but it actually makes a huge difference visually when you have a small screen and a small amount of canvas to work with to help people parse your app messages and understand them. The other thing that people are really excited about is the date picker. It's a little bit cumbersome to do right now, but a date picker will make it a lot easier for you to do things like edit the due date of a task inside Jira. In a V2, we're looking at a few more sophisticated elements, including a carousel and live tabular data. So the idea of the table inside a Slack message is that you should be able to edit it in line, change up, sort, anything you would do with that tabular data in another service without leaving the context of that message. And for things like the carousel, it's a lot easier to view a presentation. For example, when you don't have to click out to the core presentation service, you can just preview it by paging through images inside the carousel. So the more work we can make it simple to do inside Slack, the better we feel like we're going to be serving our mutual end customers. So we also know that you will probably be working with designers who may or may not be able to write this JSON themselves, even if they've seen the spec. So what we're going to be releasing alongside BlockKit is a UI builder called BlockKit Builder that will let you drag and drop each of these elements into a composed screen inside the builder. And on the right-hand side, we'll give you the copy-pastable, editable JSON that you can then use inside your app to build these beautiful messages that your design team gives the double thumbs up.
So let's talk about the next use case, which is Hugo. Hopefully some of you have met Hugo's founder, Darren. He was here all this week. Hugo is actually an app that allows you to take meeting notes in a centralized location. The really cool thing about Hugo is that it connects to so many things. The value of Hugo is it connects to your Google Calendar, it connects to Confluence, it connects to Slack, and it connects to Jira and Trello. And because of this, it actually introduces some interesting problems. And so when I was talking to Darren originally about this, it was really enlightening to understand kind of some of the technical design challenges they had. And so hopefully we can share some of those with you today. The very first thing that I always get people talking about is Atlassian ID and Slack ID, how to map them. Unfortunately, there is a very naive solution that you can take, which is just say, okay, if this email address on Slack is this, then it's this in Atlassian. But as most of us know, sometimes that just doesn't work. Like personal emails and work emails don't match up all the time. So what we recommend really is you should really use an identity provider. What this requires is whenever a user uses your apps, they're going to have to actually validate their identity. So they're going to have to say, in Atlassian, I am this email address and ID, and then in Slack, I am in this email address. This is really the best and most foolproof method to do it. I wouldn't say veer away from mapping over email address. If you're just getting in the prototype stages and trying to try stuff out, then you can definitely go with that method, but at some point, you're definitely going to hit a wall. So Slack has a bunch of different permissions, and sometimes they can be a little bit confusing. There's just numerous amounts of them. The number one thing to remember is being minimal. It's kind of a given, but especially on Slack, people are more weary of installing apps, and so it's important to remember that whenever they're installing an app, they're actually doing it on behalf of their company for the most part, and so people will avoid certain permissions. The biggest one is the warning sign, which shows up on elevated permissions. So any permission that's kind of tricky that might introduce some kind of vulnerability, or it just gives elevated permissions to things going on in Slack. You want to make sure to be aware of those and be conscious of them. I've done a bunch of user testing with Slack users, and anytime they saw this yellow thing, they would basically kind of run away. There are definitely ways to build around this and to make the best app possible without using those. The last thing is you should consider your update strategy. So this is actually kind of a tricky thing. When you think about, you ask for a certain set of permissions, you publish the App Store, you get in, and then 6 months later you decide you're going to do a whole bunch of new things with your app. It's important to think about that beforehand. I wouldn't say go out of your way to ask for those permissions early, but just consider that it's going to be kind of problematic to update your users to get the right permissions. You may even have to go back to your users and say, hey, can you update and re-auth my bot so that I can do the things I need to do for my version 2. Now with permissions comes tokens. And in Slack, there are currently 2 types of tokens that people are using. The first is the bot token. So a bot token creates a bot user. With a bot user, you basically get the same permissions as you would a regular user. So if you think about like a regular user can join a channel or talk in the channel or listen to the messages in the channel, it's pretty similar to a bot, but a little bit restricted. With a bot, you can listen to all messages of a channel that you're invited to. You can't invite yourself to a channel. You can't create your own channels, but you can create direct messages with users. And so it's important to remember that like with bot tokens, you get a certain set of permissions, and the second you move out of that, you're getting into user tokens. And so user tokens are the on behalf of, or the 3LO that we've been talking about all week, right? You're getting access on permission of a particular user to take action on behalf of them. So if you need to, with your bot, create a channel, you're going to end up having to use a user token. Now, what's tricky is you're doing it on behalf of a person, and that might not always actually emulate what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do it on behalf of your app, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to do it on behalf of a user who has no idea any context of why you've created that channel. So what I've seen a lot of developers do is you really have to use both of these in tandem. With bot token, you only get 1 bot token, so you get all those permissions, and then you use the user token kind of in limited capacity so you don't stretch out and get too many warning signs.
Or you can move toward our future, more simplified model of how we think about access to resources inside Slack through workspace tokens. So one of the things to know about working with Slack is that when you're asking users for permission, the risky permission is not write access to Slack. It's read information from Slack. And that kind of turns on its head some of the things that you might think about if you were worried about users who won't auth your app to edit their data inside Confluence or Jira or Bitbucket. It's actually riskier in Slack. Infinite noise in a channel is annoying, but people reading your data is the risky part. So when you're thinking about the permissions you ask for and you're thinking about how you roll out your application to the entire workspace, we've tried to help make this a little bit more simplified by introducing a new token type that instead of mapping to individual users, maps to a whole workspace. We call it workspace tokens, following that. And the idea is that if one person inside the organization, say you're an admin, decides to install a product like Jira or like Google Drive that should be used by everyone in the organization wall to wall, it shouldn't depend on every single person authing that app in order to get them access to it inside Slack. So what workspace tokens does is a few things. One, it enables teams to install rather than users. So you have that wall-to-wall installation. And we make it a lot simpler for admins to decide what apps should be installed org-wide and also which ones should be restricted to certain workspaces. So say you've got a Bitbucket integration that should belong to the workspace for engineering. Maybe your marketing team doesn't need to use the Bitbucket integration, and you as the admin can make that choice and make sure that the right people are using the right apps. The other thing that comes with workspace tokens is that every workspace token app that is going to be listed in the directory will need to use short-lived tokens. And this is a real security request from a lot of our customers. Previously inside Slack, all tokens were long-lived. And what workspace tokens introduces as an option, but not a requirement, only a requirement for the store, is a short-lived token and a refresh token that will allow you to update on a regular basis and not have to manually revoke if something were to go awry. So there are lots of extra benefits to workspace tokens, and I'm happy to chat with any of you who are considering building for Slack and considering building for the app directory about how you can future-proof your apps and build toward where we're heading. So workspace apps right now is in developer preview, but it's going to be out in GA very, very soon with a giant wink, very soon. So we hope that you'll take a look at workspace apps and how they can work into your app model.
Okay, so the last technical thing we're going to talk about is something when I originally talked to Darren, he said immediately, this is the hardest problem we had to solve. And so it's super interesting to think about because Hugo is built in such a central way where you have so many different apps on the outside that it's interacting with, it actually introduces a handful of technical problems. So we'll walk through a scenario. In this example, I had a meeting on my Google Calendar called Customer Feedback. And in Hugo, you can see it, there's a link in the Google Calendar invite, and then in Hugo itself, in the bottom, there's the meeting that shows up. That's a sync between Google Calendar and Hugo. Now, where things get really tricky is, let's say I had that meeting, it went really well, I took my meeting notes in Hugo, but I want to do 3 things from it. The first thing at the very top I want to do is I want to send this to my general channel in Slack, because I thought, you know, it's a good win for everyone. We want to share that people really like their product. I'm also going to make a Trello card for my personal to-do list to follow up with the engineering team on something. And the last thing is I want to back up this meeting note to our customer feedback meeting notes space in Confluence, and so I'm going to post it there. Now you're talking about 3 different products that all have to sync back to Hugo, and you want to make sure they sync back the other way too, because whenever a user in Slack comments on the post that I sent to Slack, you want to actually sync those messages back into Hugo so that people in Hugo can see those comments. And so it's a really interesting, complicated problem of just trying to keep things in sync. So this is what Darren kind of told me. The first thing you need to think about is handling all of your edge cases. So think about all the edge cases of things that could possibly happen. You post to Slack, and someone deleted that post that you originally posted to. Or maybe the Confluence space got moved. So you really have to consider all those edge cases, and then figure out the right way to error handle them. Error handling is super important because as with any API, you're going to get error responses sometimes, and you need to be able to handle those gracefully. And so when you're finding those edge cases, finding a good error handling resolution is super important. The most interesting thing that I learned from Darren in talking to him about this is he does a check on all the webhooks. So if you think about how all the webhooks are working between the different apps, you get a notification that something changed in one of those apps. Darren says it's great to use those, but it's hard to rely on them because maybe one of your microservice instances went down and you missed one of those events. And so what he does is they go back and check. They go back to Confluence and say, hey, has anything changed here? And they go back to Google Calendar and say, hey, has anything changed here either? And so they really validate. I think they do it every 30 minutes or every hour just to validate there's no massive sync problems. And yeah, so that's kind of like what Hugo's biggest problem was, and I thought it was super interesting. So as we kind of close out here, I think it was really interesting to talk about Obi and Hugo as being some of the first vendors that are really building around the Atlassian and Slack platform. And it's awesome to see how they're really helping the daily workflows of all of Slack and Atlassian's users every day.
So when you're thinking about building your integrations, and we really hope you do, we just want to reiterate that you're the expert. You know what kind of information or what kind of actual work might make sense in the context of conversation with your colleagues. So in Obi's case, it was not necessarily writing a new piece of the knowledge base and putting that into Obi, but it was lookup, and it was getting feedback on whether or not the lookup was accurate. In the Hugo case, it's all about notifications and keeping you aware of what's happening across multiple services. Think about what people might want to know and what they could do with just a click, or just a, yes, I acknowledge that this happened, or no, I want to reassign this to somebody else. Those are the most valuable actions that save people so much time and so much mental energy and switching costs.
So now we have about 5 minutes for Q&A. Bear's also going to be available afterward if you have any other follow-up questions. But
Any questions?
Oh, hey, awesome presentation. Thank you so much to both of you. I was curious about so Hugo falling back to periodic polling to ensure that they've got the latest data. Does Slack guarantee delivery on webhooks, or if I'm using the RTM API instead, like, am I pretty much guaranteed to get all activity?
No, I mean, you have to monitor to make sure your socket connection doesn't get interrupted. And that's why we recommend not using RTM. We recommend the event API instead.
Awesome. Thank you.
yeah, and I think with the events API, if for whatever reason that event failed to reach you, there's a retry, right?
Yeah,
There's
there
like
is a retry.
3-time retry over 200 milliseconds, 2 seconds, and 20 seconds or something.
Fantastic.
And so it's really like taking care of your own services and considering that your own service might go down at some point and you might miss it, right?
Cool,
Yeah,
cool.
the one where we don't guarantee delivery is ephemeral messages. Those are the ones where they have to be initiated by some user action inside Slack, like a button click or some other action, and those are the ones that say visible only to you.
Could you talk a bit more about the contract
Sure.
around ephemeral messages, like when they are delivered versus when they're not?
So because ephemeral messages are always assumed to be in response to a user action, we don't guarantee their delivery if the user signs off, for example. So you don't know whether or not the user got it, but it's assumed that if you're showing them something in response to an action they just took, they should be sticking around for it. And this is something where we have a better design solution for it coming up as soon as it's on the public roadmap to talk about and we have like actual resourcing against it. I'm sure we will talk about it, but we know that people want to send guaranteed delivery ephemeral messages.
Awesome. Thank you.
Extending on the question of Tim, this is a basic problem with delivering messages, right? Is either you received it, but you didn't receive the acknowledgement, or the retry then comes in and says, okay, I already did this. And it's a basic in all software design, if you were working with message queues. Is the fallback the only solution, and do you propose that you will always implement the polling mechanism? Because that's then bothering the network load again.
So I'll speak to it. I think it was actually more around how Atlassian webhooks work. I don't actually know what the delivery mechanism is or what the retry rate is, but I think he was doing this as a safe bet for himself and his product, rather than like, I need to go do this. So he was saying, I have 4 products I have to keep in sync, and if any one of those ever gets out of sync, I'm totally screwed because things are going to get totally out of whack. And so it was really like him making a safe bet with the understanding he's working with 4 different platforms. It wasn't like he felt like he needed to because he was working with the Slack API. Yeah. You could yell it and we could repeat it.
Yeah.
Because I was just at the talk of the general platform discussion where this actually is going to be extended. If you have the general platform with all Atlassian products, with queuing mechanism, and then the Slack integration, this might pose as a real problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know much about that. I haven't been well rehearsed in that, so I can follow up and get you the right contact to answer that question.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for coming to this talk. Please fill out the survey and let us know how we did. And thank you once again for our speakers.